The thunderous roar of artillery faded as Karl Berger surrendered to American troops in the hedgerows of Normandy in July 1944. The young Wehrmacht soldier, blood-caked and exhausted, expected the worst. Stories had circulated among German troops about American savagery, tales of summary executions and brutal interrogations fabricated by Goebbels's propaganda machine. As Berger was searched, disarmed, and loaded onto a transport truck, he silently rehearsed only his name, rank, and serial number, all he believed he would be permitted to say before whatever grim fate awaited. But what followed in the coming days, weeks, and months would shatter not just his expectations, but the worldview that had been carefully constructed by years of Nazi indoctrination. The America that Karl Berger and nearly 372,000 other German prisoners of war would experience between 1943 and 1946 represented a shocking contrast to the wartime realities elsewhere, a contrast so profound that many would later refer to their captivity as the Golden Cage. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The American decision to adhere strictly to the Geneva Convention in its treatment of prisoners of war stands as one of the most remarkable yet overlooked humanitarian chapters of World War II. While Europe burned and Pacific islands turned to slaughterhouses, an unexpected parallel reality emerged across the American heartland. A network of over 700 POW camps housing enemy soldiers in conditions that would prove not merely humane, but often comfortable enough to astonish the prisoners themselves. This adherence to international law came not from naivety, but from a strategic understanding of both moral authority and practical warfare that would echo well beyond the war years. In the early dawn hours of February 1943, the first major contingent of German POWs arrived on American soil at Camp Shanks, New York. Most were captured during the North African Campaign, members of Rommel's vaunted Africa Corps. As they disembarked from crowded transport ships, many prepared themselves for the mistreatment they had been told to expect. Colonel Wilhelm von Schlieben, one of the highest-ranking officers captured in early operations, later recalled, "We expected to be paraded through the streets, perhaps even subjected to public humiliation. Instead, we were processed efficiently, provided with clean quarters, and served a hot meal that would have been considered a feast on the front lines." The American approach to prisoner handling had been meticulously planned well before the first captives arrived. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into the war, the State Department and War Department collaborated to establish a comprehensive framework for POW management that would adhere scrupulously to the 1929 Geneva Convention. This decision was influenced by several crucial factors: concern for American servicemen in enemy hands, the practical benefits of encouraging enemy surrenders, and a fundamental belief that demonstrating American values through action would serve as powerful psychological warfare. Major General Archer Lurch, appointed as Provost Marshal General in 1944, oversaw much of the POW program and articulated its philosophy succinctly in a classified memorandum. The manner in which we treat prisoners of war will have direct bearing on how our own men are treated. Beyond this, we demonstrate through our actions the principles for which we claim to be fighting. This is not sentimentality, but practical warfare. By mid-1943, the POW program had expanded dramatically, as Allied victories in North Africa and then Italy sent thousands of Axis prisoners to American shores. The War Department, facing a massive logistical challenge, made a crucial decision that would shape the entire program: the widespread distribution of POW camps across the American interior. Rather than concentrating prisoners in a few large facilities, camps were established in 46 states, often near agricultural regions where labor shortages had become acute due to military mobilization. The typical POW camp in America bore little resemblance to the barbed wire hellscapes that would later be discovered in Europe and Asia. While security measures were certainly present, guard towers, fences, and armed patrols, the internal organization of the camps followed a remarkably different philosophy. Housing typically consisted of standard military barracks with proper heating, plumbing, and ventilation. Prisoners received the same rations as American garrison troops, a standard that exceeded what many had experienced in their own military. Medical care was provided by both American personnel and captured German medical officers, while recreation facilities often included athletic fields, libraries, and even theaters. For Hans Muller, captured in Sicily in 1943 and transported to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the contrast was stark. I had been living on reduced rations for months before my capture. In the American camp, I gained 10 kilograms in my first 8 weeks. We had meat almost daily, eggs, milk, things that had become rare luxuries in Germany. Some men thought it was a trick at first, that they were fattening us up for some purpose. The camp experience was not uniform across all facilities. The American authorities categorized prisoners according to their political reliability, separating confirmed Nazi Party members and ideological hardliners from those deemed less fanatical. Camp Alva in Oklahoma and Camp Ruston in Louisiana became known for housing some of the more dedicated Nazi adherents, while other camps developed reputations for their more relaxed atmospheres. This segregation served multiple purposes, not least of which was protecting prisoners who might be targeted by Nazi loyalists for being insufficiently committed to the regime. The American approach to prisoner management emphasized both work and education. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, though officers could not, and the War Department quickly implemented a massive labor program. By 1944, over 95% of eligible prisoners were employed in agriculture, food processing, logging, or other non-military industries. They received payment for their labor, 80 cents per day on average, credited to their camp accounts, a practice that not only complied with international law, but also provided a powerful incentive for productive work. Fritz Engelmann, who worked harvesting cotton in Arkansas, later wrote, "We had been told Americans were soft, undisciplined, and would collapse when faced with German efficiency. Yet here we were, witnessing an agricultural system of staggering productivity with technology we had only dreamed of in Europe. It was our first clue that we had been deceived about many things." The educational programs implemented in the camps represented perhaps the most ambitious aspect of the American POW policy. While partly designed to combat boredom and maintain order, they also reflected a deeper strategic vision, the potential re-education of at least a portion of the German military that would eventually return to help rebuild their country. By 1944, formal educational programs had been established in most camps, offering courses ranging from basic English language instruction to college-level classes in science, literature, and democratic political theory. Captain Kenneth Rexford, educational officer at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, observed, "We're not conducting crude propaganda. The approach is to present facts, encourage critical thinking, and allow these men to draw their own conclusions. Many have been isolated from objective information about world events for years. Just providing uncensored news reports and access to books previously forbidden to them has proven remarkably effective." The religious life of the camps represented another sphere where American policy diverged sharply from that of other warring powers. Prisoners were granted complete religious freedom with both Protestant and Catholic chaplains made available. Many camps constructed their own chapels, often with materials and labor provided by the prisoners themselves. For men who had experienced the Reich's increasingly antagonistic stance toward religious institutions, particularly those that challenged state authority, this religious tolerance provided another contrast that prompted reflection. Cultural activities flourished in many camps, with prisoner-organized theater groups, orchestras, and art studios receiving support from American authorities, and sometimes the YMCA or Red Cross. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, prisoners produced sophisticated theatrical productions of classical German plays and operas, while the camp orchestra at Fort McClellan, Alabama, gained such a reputation for excellence that special permission was occasionally granted for them to perform for local civilian audiences under guard. Beyond the confines of the camps, perhaps the most surprising aspect of the POW program was the extent of contact between German prisoners and ordinary Americans. While fraternization was officially discouraged, the reality of placing hundreds of thousands of foreign soldiers in small-town America inevitably led to interactions that would have lasting impact on both groups. Farm families who employed POW labor often developed cordial relations with their Germans, sometimes inviting them for meals or holiday celebrations, despite regulations against such informal contact. In Aliceville, Alabama, local resident Martha Ferguson remembered, "At first there was some hostility. Many families had sons fighting overseas. But over time, people began to see the prisoners as individuals, not just the enemy. They were mostly young men, far from home, and many locals recognized that, but for the accident of birth, our own boys might have been in their position." This is not to suggest that the POW experience was universally positive or without significant tensions. Escape attempts occurred throughout the program, though most were short-lived and appeared motivated more by restlessness than by any realistic hope of returning to Germany. Nazi loyalists within the camps sometimes attempted to maintain party discipline, threatening or assaulting prisoners who seemed too cooperative with Americans or who expressed doubts about Germany's eventual victory. In some cases, prisoners suspected of disloyalty to the Reich were murdered by fellow captives, prompting American authorities to implement more thorough segregation of prisoners based on political orientation. By late 1944, as Allied advances made Germany's defeat increasingly certain, the atmosphere in many camps began to shift. Access to uncensored news about the war's progress, including the liberation of concentration camps and the destruction of German cities, forced many prisoners to confront uncomfortable realities about the regime they had served. For some, this led to crisis and despair. For others, a process of re-evaluation began that would continue long after the war. Ernst Kramer, held at Camp Breckenridge in Kentucky, wrote in his diary in April 1945, "Today they showed us photographs from something called Buchenwald. Many refused to look, saying it was propaganda. I looked. If even a fraction of these images is genuine, we have been complicit in something monstrous. I cannot sleep tonight." The American approach to prisoner re-education became more formalized in the war's final months. The Special Projects Division, established under the Provost Marshal General's Office and staffed by academic specialists and German émigrés, developed subtle approaches to introducing democratic concepts and encouraging critical examination of National Socialism. Rather than heavy-handed propaganda, the program emphasized factual information, intellectual freedom, and voluntary participation. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, a special facility was established where selected prisoners produced a newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, which circulated among POW camps nationwide. While ostensibly created by and for prisoners, it was carefully supervised to promote democratic values and critical perspectives on Nazism without appearing as obvious propaganda. The publication's subtle approach proved far more effective than direct indoctrination would have been. As the European War neared its end, new tensions emerged in the POW program. The revelations of Nazi atrocities, particularly the liberation of concentration camps, generated understandable anger among Americans, including some camp personnel. Yet, official policy continued to emphasize professional treatment of prisoners, even as the nature of new arrivals changed. The final groups of German POWs sent to America included a higher percentage of SS members and dedicated Nazis, captured during the Reich's last desperate defense. Captain Richard Tiedemann, a camp administrator in Texas, recalled, "It became more difficult to maintain the previous standards as news of German atrocities became widespread. Some guards wanted retribution. We had to remind them repeatedly that our commitment to proper treatment wasn't based on the enemy's worthiness, but on our own principles and practical concerns for American POWs still in German hands." The end of hostilities in Europe in May 1945 didn't immediately change the status of German POWs in America. International law required that repatriation occur as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace, but with Germany under Allied occupation and no formal peace treaty in sight, the legal situation remained ambiguous. The American government, facing massive demobilization of its own forces while still conducting war in the Pacific, made the practical decision to maintain the POW labor program through the crucial 1945 harvest season. This decision generated controversy, both domestically and internationally. Labor unions expressed concern about competition from POW workers, while some international observers questioned whether continued detention constituted a violation of the Geneva Convention. The War Department defended the policy on pragmatic grounds, noting the vital importance of the agricultural production to which POW labor contributed, as well as the chaotic conditions in occupied Germany that would complicate immediate mass repatriation. For many prisoners, the months following Germany's surrender were marked by uncertainty and growing impatience. Letters from home, which began to arrive more regularly, brought devastating news of destroyed cities, food shortages, and families struggling in the ruins of the Reich. Against this backdrop, the relative comfort of American captivity created complex emotional responses: relief at being safe, guilt at not sharing in homeland suffering, and increasing desire to return to help rebuild. Walter Kroner, interned at Camp Robinson in Arkansas, expressed this ambivalence in a letter to his brother, also a POW, but in a different camp. "We sit here with full stomachs while our families scavenge for food. Yet I wonder what awaits us in Germany. We're despised by the world, our cities are rubble, and everything we were taught to believe has been exposed as criminal madness. Perhaps this time in America is preparation for the harder journey ahead, learning to be Germans of a different kind." The American authorities recognized the potential represented by their German captives, men who had experienced American society firsthand and might serve as bridges between occupiers and occupied in post-war Germany. The re-education program intensified during this period, with selected prisoners receiving specialized training in democratic governance, civil administration, and economic reconstruction. At Fort Eustis, Virginia, a special school was established for prisoners deemed most receptive to democratic ideas, providing them with knowledge and skills intended to be useful in rebuilding German civic institutions. As 1945 progressed into autumn, the War Department began implementing a phased repatriation plan. Priority was given to prisoners with specialized skills needed for reconstruction, those with pressing family circumstances, and those deemed most thoroughly denazified. By November, ships carrying the first substantial groups of returnees departed American ports, beginning a process that would continue through 1946. Their reception in defeated Germany would prove complicated. They returned to a country physically devastated, politically transformed, and emotionally traumatized. Many would find their well-fed appearance and American-acquired possessions generated resentment among civilians who had endured bombing and privation. Others discovered their American experience made them objects of suspicion under Allied occupation authorities concerned about Nazi sympathizers. For Karl Berger, the young soldier captured in Normandy with whom we began, the return journey to Bavaria in early 1946 brought him back to a hometown he barely recognized. The medieval church square where he had played as a child was now surrounded by rubble. His family, thankfully alive, had subsisted on rations far smaller than what he had received as a prisoner. As he unpacked the books, clothing, and other items accumulated during captivity, his mother wept. not from joy at his possessions, but at the stark evidence of how differently their wars had ended. "I returned with more than I had left with," Berger later wrote, "not just material things, but a fundamentally changed understanding of America, of Germany, and of myself. In the strangest of ironies, it was as a prisoner that I first experienced true freedom of thought." As the ships carrying the last German POWs departed American shores in July 1946, they left behind a legacy more complex and far-reaching than anyone might have predicted when the program began. The POW experience would influence not just individual lives, but the broader relationship between America and post-war Germany. Many former prisoners would play significant roles in Germany's democratic reconstruction, bringing their American experiences directly into the process of building a new German identity from the ashes of the Third Reich. The contrast between American treatment of German POWs and the horrific realities emerging from liberated concentration camps and Soviet prison camps could not have been more stark. As the true scale of Nazi atrocities became known, the American adherence to humanitarian standards appeared even more exceptional. It represented not weakness, as Nazi ideology might have characterized it, but a powerful demonstration of the democratic values that had ultimately triumphed. What awaited these returning prisoners in a divided, occupied Germany? How would their American experience influence their role in rebuilding their shattered country? And how would the American POW program ultimately be judged by history? As former enemies became crucial allies in a new global conflict, the seeds planted in those POW camps would yield unexpected and significant harvest. The repatriation process for German POWs proceeded throughout 1946, governed by complex logistical and political considerations that reflected the changing international landscape. Priority for return was determined by a combination of factors: occupational skills needed for reconstruction, political reliability as assessed by American authorities, and humanitarian concerns regarding family circumstances. By spring, ships departed weekly from ports in New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans, carrying former prisoners back to a homeland many barely recognized. For the American military and civil authorities who had managed the massive POW program, this final phase presented new challenges. Captain Howard Blossom, who supervised repatriation processing at Fort Dix, New Jersey, noted, "These men are returning to a devastated country under foreign occupation. Many have families they haven't seen in years, if they're still alive at all. Our job isn't just shipping bodies back, it's preparing them as best we can for what they'll face." This preparation included practical assistance. Each repatriate received a discharge payment based on work credits accumulated during captivity, converted to German currency. They were provided with civilian clothing, basic toiletries, and in many cases, packages of food and supplies to assist during their initial reintegration. More significantly, they received documentation of educational achievements, work experience, and specialized training obtained during captivity, credentials that might prove valuable in securing employment in occupied Germany. The journey home itself became a period of psychological transition. Johannes Haider, returning to Westphalia in March 1946, described the Atlantic crossing as increasingly somber. "The closer we came to Europe, the quieter the ship became. We had lived in a kind of American bubble, even as prisoners. Now we faced the reality of defeat, occupation, and the judgment of history. Many men who had seemed confident in the camps became withdrawn, anxious about what awaited them. What did await them was a Germany transformed beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, with an estimated 40% of urban housing destroyed. The economy had collapsed, with industrial production at approximately 30% of pre-war levels. Food shortages approached famine conditions in many regions. The discovery of concentration camps had exposed the true nature of the regime they had served, while the presence of occupying armies from 4 different nations reinforced the totality of defeat. In this environment, returning POWs encountered complex and often contradictory receptions. For some families, their return represented miraculous good fortune amid overwhelming loss. Yet their well-fed appearance and American-acquired possessions sometimes generated resentment among civilians who had endured bombing campaigns and severe privation. Many returnees found themselves caught between conflicting expectations, treated with suspicion by occupation authorities concerned about Nazi recidivism, while simultaneously viewed as potentially tainted by American ideas among more traditional or nationalist Germans. Herbert Kessler, who had spent 2 years in Texas, returned to find his home in Hamburg reduced to a single habitable room in an otherwise destroyed apartment building. His training as an electrician during captivity quickly secured him work with the British Occupation Administration. "My neighbors were starving," he recalled in a 1975 interview. "I had learned skills that made me valuable to the British." When I tried to explain how Americans had treated us as prisoners, many Germans simply couldn't comprehend it. They assumed I was lying or had collaborated. The contrast between what I had experienced and what they had lived through created a gulf that took years to bridge. This gulf was further complicated by the emerging political geography of occupied Germany. Prisoners returning to the Soviet occupation zone faced particular challenges, often subjected to additional screening and suspicion by Soviet authorities who viewed time in American captivity as potential ideological contamination. Some were even rearrested and sent to Soviet labor camps, particularly those with pre-war connections to industries or resources of interest to the Soviet Union. Awareness of these risks led some former POWs assigned to return to the Soviet zone to attempt escape during transport, seeking refuge in the Western occupation zones. Against this backdrop of physical destruction and social dislocation, many returned prisoners found that their American experience had provided them with unexpected advantages. Their exposure to American industrial methods, agricultural techniques, and business practices represented valuable knowledge in a country desperate for reconstruction. Their English language skills proved useful in navigating occupation bureaucracy. Most significantly, those who had genuinely embraced democratic ideas found themselves aligned with the political direction being encouraged by Western occupation authorities. The influence of the American POW experience on Germany's post-war development operated at multiple levels. At the most direct, a number of former prisoners who had participated in specialized training programs were recruited by American occupation authorities to assist in denazification efforts and democratic institution building. The Counterintelligence Corps actively recruited former POWs as informants and investigators, valuing their ability to identify Nazi officials and party members attempting to disguise their past associations. More broadly, former POWs often emerged as important intermediaries in the complex relationship between occupiers and occupied. Having lived in America, they could interpret American intentions and methods to their countrymen, sometimes diffusing tensions or misunderstandings. A report from the Office of Military Government for Germany noted, "Former POWs returned from the United States frequently demonstrate more realistic understanding of American objectives than other Germans, and often serve as unofficial interpreters of American policy within their communities." The formal re-education program that had been implemented in the camps, while limited in scope, did produce a cadre of Germans specifically trained for roles in emerging democratic institutions. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, and Fort Getty, New Jersey, special schools had prepared selected prisoners for potential leadership roles in post-war Germany. These men received intensive training in democratic governance, civil administration, and free market economics. Many subsequently found positions in the new governmental structures established under occupation auspices. Werner Blankenhorn, who had been captured in North Africa and spent 3 years at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, before attending the Fort Getty program, returned to his native Baden-Württemberg and eventually rose to become a district administrator, Landrat, in the 1950s. In his memoirs, he directly credited his American captivity. What I witnessed in America contradicted everything National Socialism had taught us about democracies being weak, decadent, and inefficient. Instead, I saw a society of remarkable productivity, genuine liberty, and practical problem-solving. These observations formed the foundation of my subsequent political career. The implications of the American POW program extended even to Germany's economic reconstruction. The German economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, of the 1950s drew on multiple influences, but the transfer of knowledge facilitated by returning prisoners played a measurable role. Former POWs who had worked in American agriculture brought back insights about mechanization, crop rotation, and farm management. Those exposed to American manufacturing introduced production methods and workplace practices that contributed to industrial efficiency. Helmut Schmidt, who would later serve as Chancellor of West Germany from 1974 to 1982, observed in a 1987 interview that the American POW program had created thousands of unofficial ambassadors who had seen America from the inside, not as tourists, but as participants in daily life. They returned with realistic impressions rather than propaganda-fueled fantasies, and this helped establish the foundation for genuine German-American partnership during the Cold War. The long-term psychological impact on the prisoners themselves varied widely. For some, captivity remained a humiliating chapter best forgotten. For others, it represented a transformative experience that fundamentally altered their worldview. Many maintained a lifelong ambivalence, grateful for humane treatment, yet unable to fully reconcile this with their status as defeated enemy soldiers who had served a criminal regime. Joseph Kramer, who had been a committed Nazi when captured in Italy in 1943, underwent a profound transformation during 2 years at Camp Ruston, Louisiana. In post-war Germany, he became an educator dedicated to promoting democratic values. In America, I was forced to confront reality without the filter of propaganda, he wrote in 1960. The most powerful re-education wasn't in formal classes, but in daily observations, seeing Black and white Americans working together, witnessing religious freedom in practice, having access to uncensored information. These experiences didn't make me American, but they helped me envision a different kind of German future. The contrast between American treatment of German POWs and Soviet handling of their captives became increasingly stark as reports filtered back from those returning from Russian captivity. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by Soviet forces, an estimated 1/3 died in captivity due to malnutrition, disease, and forced labor in extreme conditions. Those who survived often returned with severe physical and psychological damage. This contrast reinforced pro-Western sentiment among many Germans and contributed to Cold War political alignments. By the early 1950s, as West Germany moved toward sovereignty and NATO membership, the legacy of the POW experience helped facilitate this dramatic reversal of relationships. Former prisoners who had assumed positions in government, education, business, and other sectors often served as bridges in developing new German-American partnerships. Their first-hand knowledge of America helped counter Soviet propaganda and strengthened West Germany's Western orientation during critical Cold War years. The American POW program's influence extended even to cultural dimensions of post-war German life. Former prisoners introduced American sports, music, literature, and other cultural elements they had encountered during captivity. Baseball clubs formed in several German cities directly traced their origins to returning POWs who had learned the game in American camps. Jazz music, which had been condemned as degenerate by the Nazi regime, found enthusiastic promotion among former prisoners who had developed appreciation for it during captivity. Bernhard Meyer, who had worked in camp administration at Fort Custer, Michigan, established one of West Germany's first business schools based on American models in 1952. What impressed me most about America wasn't just material prosperity, but the practical approach to education, he explained. The emphasis on problem-solving rather than rote memorization, the connection between education and real-world application, these were concepts I was determined to introduce in Germany. For American authorities, the POW program represented a complex legacy that defied simple evaluation. Its primary purpose had been custody of enemy combatants in accordance with international law. Yet it had evolved into something more ambitious, a demonstration of democratic values and an investment in future relations with a post-Nazi Germany. The program's $50 million cost, approximately $780 million in 2024 dollars, had been substantially offset by the value of prisoner labor, estimated at $230 million, thus making it financially beneficial while simultaneously advancing humanitarian and strategic objectives. Major General Edward Fry, who oversaw much of the program's implementation, reflected in 1960, "We didn't set out to remake German society through our POW camps. Our primary responsibility was humane custody in accordance with the Geneva Convention, but in fulfilling that responsibility properly, we inadvertently created one of our most effective instruments of post-war influence. These men saw American democracy up close, under circumstances where propaganda couldn't explain away what they were witnessing." The personal connections established during captivity sometimes endured for decades. Beginning in the 1950s, former prisoners began returning to America as visitors, often seeking out families who had employed them, camp staff who had treated them with respect, or communities where they had spent significant time. Local newspapers across America occasionally featured stories of these reunions, German businessmen, educators, or government officials returning to the small towns where they had once been enemy prisoners. Hans Günther, captured at Anzio in 1944 and held at Camp Grant, Illinois, returned to Rockford in 1962 with his family. The local newspaper reported his emotional reunion with the farm family who had employed him. 17 years ago, he picked corn on their farm as a prisoner of war. Yesterday, Mr. Günther arrived as a successful Hamburg businessman, bringing his wife and children to meet the Americans who had shown him kindness when he was an enemy soldier. Such stories multiplied as travel between Germany and America became more common, contributing to grassroots reconciliation that paralleled official diplomatic relationships. By the 1960s, several communities with former POW camps had established sister city relationships with German towns, often facilitated by former prisoners who had maintained connections with Americans they met during captivity. The broader historical significance of the American POW program has been subjected to varying interpretations. Critics have noted that the humanitarian treatment accorded German prisoners stood in stark contrast to the discrimination faced by many Americans, particularly racial minorities, during the same period. The irony that German prisoners could dine in restaurants that refused service to Black American soldiers became a powerful symbol of American racial contradictions. Others have questioned whether the re-education aspects of the program constituted a violation of the Geneva Convention's prohibitions against propaganda. Defenders of the program point to its practical benefits. The humanitarian treatment of German POWs may have encouraged surrenders that saved lives on both sides, while potentially improving conditions for American prisoners in German hands. The re-education component, while arguably skirting the edges of Geneva Convention restrictions, helped facilitate Germany's successful post-war democratic transition, an outcome beneficial to Germans and the wider world. Perhaps the most balanced assessment comes from historian Arnold Kramer, who devoted decades to studying the POW program. The American approach represented an unusual convergence of idealism and pragmatism. By treating prisoners humanely, the United States demonstrated the values for which it claimed to be fighting, while simultaneously advancing its strategic interests. The program's success challenges the cynical assumption that nations must choose between ethical principles and practical advantages. For For the prisoners themselves, the diverse experiences in American captivity became integral parts of their life stories, influencing their post-war trajectories in ways both obvious and subtle. Werner Braun, who had been a 20-year-old tank crewman when captured in France and spent 18 months at Camp Wheeler, Georgia, reflected 50 years later, "My American captivity taught me that enemies need not remain enemies forever, that people can maintain humanity even in war, and that societies can transform themselves when given the chance." These weren't abstract lessons, but lived experiences that shaped everything that followed. The American POW camps had been dismantled by late 1946, their structures repurposed or demolished, their grounds returned to previous uses or dedicated to new ones. What remained was less tangible, but perhaps more significant, an experience shared by hundreds of thousands of men that would influence German-American relations for generations. As Cold War tensions transformed former enemies into allies, this shared history provided foundations for partnership that transcended official policies and diplomatic agreements. Kurt Vonnegut, the acclaimed American novelist who had been a prisoner of the Germans in Dresden during the devastating Allied bombing, once observed, "I think the highest compliment you can pay a human being is to say he or she behaved decently in an indecent time." The American treatment of German POWs, while imperfect and operating within the constraints of wartime necessities, largely met this standard. In doing so, it demonstrated that even amid history's most destructive conflict, maintaining humanity remained both possible and profoundly consequential. Decades later, as former enemies became partners in NATO, trading partners, and eventually allies in new international challenges, the relationships forged in those POW camps continued to bear fruit. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany moved toward reunification, some American diplomats and military leaders involved in the process discovered that their German counterparts included men who had once been prisoners in America, men whose understanding of American society had been shaped not by propaganda but by direct experience. Hans Werner, who had spent 2 years at Camp Bowie, Texas, before returning to become an influential journalist in post-war Germany, summed up the historical irony. "We went to America as Hitler's soldiers and returned as witnesses to an alternative vision of what Germany might become." Many of us had been taught that American democracy was a sham, that racial mixing had weakened them beyond recovery, that only the authoritarian state could achieve greatness. In America, even as prisoners, we saw the bankruptcy of these ideas with our own eyes. The real re-education wasn't in classrooms, but in countless small revelations. The black sergeant who treated us with professional respect, the prosperous farms operated by independent families rather than state collectives, the matter-of-fact freedom with which Americans criticized their own government without fear. These observations, multiplied across thousands of returning prisoners, helped inoculate post-war Germany against extremist ideologies that might otherwise have found fertile ground amid the devastation of defeat. The contrast between American treatment of German prisoners and the horrific conditions in Nazi concentration camps became even more pronounced as awareness of the Holocaust spread. When American authorities began showing documentary footage of liberated camps to German POWs in spring 1945, the reactions ranged from shocked disbelief to profound moral crisis. For many, these revelations shattered remaining loyalty to the Nazi regime and catalyzed a re-evaluation of their own complicity. Otto Reimer, held at Camp Cook, California, described this moment. "When they showed us the films from Buchenwald, many refused to watch or dismissed it as propaganda. I watched and knew it was true. That night in the barracks was the quietest I had ever experienced. Men lay awake, confronting what had been done in our name. The American guard who had shown us the film didn't gloat or condemn us collectively. He simply said, 'This is why we're fighting.' His restraint in that moment seemed to me more powerful than any punishment could have been. This reckoning with Nazi crimes, occurring within the context of humane treatment by their American captors, created cognitive dissonance that proved fertile ground for genuine reevaluation. The POW experience didn't automatically transform Nazi supporters into Democrats, but it created conditions where such transformation became possible for many, a process that would continue long after repatriation. By the 1970s, as the World War II generation began reaching retirement age, more formal efforts emerged to document the POW experience. Several universities established oral history projects collecting testimonies from both former prisoners and Americans involved in the camp system. Historical societies in communities that had hosted camps organized exhibitions and commemorations, often featuring reunions between former adversaries now linked by shared history. Friedrich Hohmann, who had been captured in the Falaise Pocket in 1944 and held at Camp Ellis, Illinois, returned in 1985 for such an event. He brought with him artwork he had created during captivity, detailed sketches of camp life that now provided valuable historical documentation. "I came to America as an enemy and was treated as a human being," he told the gathering. "I return as a friend to say thank you." The lessons I learned here as a prisoner helped build the democratic Germany that emerged from the ruins. The American POW program's emphasis on education and voluntary re-education rather than punishment or indoctrination stood in stark contrast to approaches taken by other belligerent nations. The Soviet Union used German POWs primarily as forced labor under harsh conditions that resulted in mortality rates exceeding 30%. Even Britain, America's closest ally, employed more coercive re-education methods at camps like Wilton Park, where prisoners were subjected to intensive political reprogramming. The American approach, offering education as opportunity rather than requirement, proved more effective in fostering genuine ideological reconsideration. Colonel Edward Davidson, who directed educational programs at Fort McClellan, Alabama, explained the philosophy. "We found that men who voluntarily attended classes, read previously forbidden books, or participated in discussion groups were far more likely to internalize democratic concepts than those subjected to forced indoctrination." The key was creating an environment where they could question their previous beliefs without losing face. This insight would later influence denazification approaches in occupied Germany. American occupation authorities, drawing on POW program experience, increasingly emphasized positive incentives for democratic participation rather than punitive measures for past Nazi affiliation, a strategy that proved more successful than the more aggressive denazification initially attempted in the Soviet zone. As Cold War divisions hardened in the late 1940s, former German POWs often found themselves on the front lines of new ideological battles. Those who had returned to areas under Soviet control sometimes faced persecution specifically because of their American experience. In the Western zones, however, that same experience frequently provided advantages in the emerging political and economic order. Konrad Adenauer, who became the first Chancellor of West Germany, recognized the potential value of these men with direct exposure to American society. His government actively recruited former POWs for diplomatic service, particularly for postings to the United States, valuing their first-hand understanding of American culture and institutions. Several prominent West German diplomats of the 1950s and 1960s had spent time in American POW camps, their careers ironically advanced by what had begun as the misfortune of capture. By the mid-1950s, with West Germany rearming as a NATO member, another dimension of the POW legacy emerged. The new Bundeswehr, Federal Defense Force, explicitly rejected Wehrmacht traditions, seeking instead to establish a military ethos compatible with democratic governance. Among the officers helping shape this new approach were numerous former POWs whose American experience had demonstrated an alternative model of military organization, one subordinate to civilian authority and compatible with democratic values. General Wolfgraf von Baudissin, one of the principal architects of the Bundeswehr's concept of citizens in uniform, had been captured in North Africa and held at Camp McCain, Mississippi. He later acknowledged that observing the different relationship between American society and its military had influenced his thinking about how democratic Germany could maintain military forces without reviving militarism. The official German-American relationship that developed during the Cold War built upon foundations partly laid by the POW program. While high-level diplomacy and strategic interests drove formal alliances, the hundreds of thousands of personal connections established during captivity created channels of understanding that operated below official levels. This second track of German-American relations helped sustain partnership through political changes and occasional tensions. At the community level, the POW legacy continued to reveal itself in unexpected ways. In Hearne, Texas, where Camp Hearne had housed thousands of German prisoners, a local historical preservation effort in the 1990s uncovered concrete foundations of prisoner-built fountains and gardens. This discovery sparked renewed interest in the camp's history, eventually leading to the establishment of a museum and research center that documented both the POW experience and its impact on local history. Similar projects emerged in communities across America, from Maine to California, as aging witnesses from both sides recognized the historical significance of what had occurred. These grassroots efforts to document and commemorate the POW program often revealed previously unknown dimensions of the experience. The romantic relationships that occasionally developed between prisoners and local women, despite regulations against fraternization. The artistic and cultural contributions prisoners made to isolated rural communities. The lasting economic impacts of POW labor on local agricultural development. Friedrich Ulrich, who had worked on a Nebraska farm during his captivity and returned in 1992 to visit, expressed surprise at finding himself remembered. "I thought we would be forgotten, just a footnote in the war's history. Instead, I find an entire exhibition in the county museum, photographs of us working in the fields, even artifacts we created preserved as historical items. Our presence here mattered in ways none of us could have imagined." For the communities that had hosted camps, the POW experience often represented their most direct connection to the global conflict. In many small towns, the arrival of German prisoners had brought the war home in tangible ways, humanizing an enemy previously known only through propaganda and creating lasting impressions that complicated simplistic wartime narratives. Martha Jenkins, who had been a teenager in Opelika, Alabama, when German prisoners arrived at nearby Camp Opelika, recalled 70 years later, "Before they came, Germans were just faceless enemies in newsreels. Then, suddenly, they were real people walking past our house under guard, young men not so different from our own boys overseas. Some played musical instruments beautifully, others were talented artists. It made the war more complicated for us, understanding that our enemies were human too." By the early 21st century, as the World War II generation passed from the scene, the direct human connections established during the POW program began transitioning to historical memory. The children and grandchildren of former prisoners sometimes made pilgrimages to the sites where their fathers or grandfathers had been held, seeking to understand this chapter of family history. Universities and historical societies accelerated efforts to collect remaining testimonies and preserve records before first-hand witnesses were gone. What emerged from these preservation efforts was a more nuanced understanding of the POW program's significance, not merely as a successfully managed wartime necessity, but as an inadvertent experiment in cross-cultural understanding and reconciliation that yielded long-term diplomatic dividends. The program demonstrated how adhering to humanitarian principles, even toward enemies, could advance both moral and strategic objectives, a lesson with continued relevance for later conflicts. Historian Robert Doyle, in his comprehensive study of the program, concluded, "The treatment of German POWs in America represents one of the more successful aspects of American conduct during World War II, not just in its humanitarian dimensions, but in its long-term impact on post-war reconstruction and Cold War alliance building. It stands as evidence that treating enemies with dignity need not be viewed as weakness, but can instead serve as a source of strength and influence. The America that German prisoners encountered between 1943 and 1946 was itself a nation in transition, grappling with racial inequalities, expanding government responsibilities, and an emerging international leadership role. The contradictions these prisoners observed, a nation fighting for democracy while maintaining racial segregation, championing freedom while placing its own Japanese-American citizens in internment camps, became part of the complex picture they carried back to Germany. Yet for many, these contradictions didn't diminish their appreciation for American strengths, but rather humanized the nation, making its democratic achievements seem more attainable rather than idealized abstractions. Walter Schoenstedt, who had been a 19-year-old Wehrmacht conscript when captured in France and spent 18 months at Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, later wrote, "America was not paradise. It had visible flaws and injustices, but it was a society visibly wrestling with its problems, capable of self-criticism and gradual improvement. This gave me hope that Germany, too, could acknowledge its far greater moral catastrophe and begin the difficult process of building something better." If democracy had been presented to us as perfect, it would have seemed an impossible standard. Instead, we saw it as an ongoing project, flawed but vital, capable of evolution and self-correction. This perspective of democracy as process rather than perfection influenced many former prisoners who assumed roles in West Germany's new democratic institutions. They brought a pragmatic rather than ideological approach to democratic governance, helping establish a political culture that valued stability, incremental reform, and constitutional protections against the types of extremism that had previously destroyed German democracy. As the final ships carrying German POWs departed American ports in 1946, few involved, American authorities, camp personnel, local communities, or the prisoners themselves, could have fully anticipated the long-term significance of what had transpired. What had begun as a logistical necessity had evolved into a complex human exchange with implications extending far beyond its immediate military context. For Karl Berger, the young soldier with whom we began this narrative, captivity represented both ending and beginning. Captured in Normandy, expecting the worst, he instead experienced an alternative vision of how societies might function. Returning to Bavaria in 1946, he used the electrical training received in captivity to establish a small repair business that eventually grew into a successful manufacturing enterprise. In 1962, he hosted an American exchange student, the grandson of a guard from his POW camp, with whom he had maintained correspondence. That student later became a diplomat, serving in the American embassy in Bonn during German reunification negotiations. Such connections, multiplied across thousands of lives, created invisible threads binding former enemies together as they faced new challenges in a rapidly changing world. The story of German POWs in America thus extends beyond the wartime experience itself to the transformed relationships that followed, a reminder that even amid history's darkest chapters, human connections can establish foundations for future reconciliation. The American POW program's humanitarian approach, while noteworthy for its time, should not be romanticized or separated from its historical context. It operated within a brutal global conflict and reflected complex mixtures of principle and pragmatism. Yet its legacy suggests that treating captured enemies with dignity, providing education rather than indoctrination, and demonstrating through action rather than proclamation the values a society claims to uphold can yield benefits extending far beyond the immediate circumstances of conflict. In an era when humanitarian principles often seem secondary to security concerns, when expedience frequently trumps ethical considerations in treatment of captives, the American POW program of World War II offers a compelling historical example of an alternative approach, one that maintained security while simultaneously advancing both humanitarian and strategic objectives. Its success challenges the false dichotomy between ethical treatment and effective policy, suggesting instead that adhering to humanitarian principles can serve both moral and practical aims. The contrast between American treatment of German POWs and the horrific conditions in Nazi concentration camps and Soviet gulags remains among the most striking moral disparities of the war. That contrast was not lost on the prisoners themselves, many of whom recognized that their experience of captivity had inadvertently become a powerful education in the different possibilities for organizing human societies, a lesson many would carry back to a Germany in desperate need of new foundations. For modern viewers reflecting on this historical episode, perhaps its most valuable lesson lies in this demonstration that even in wartime, societies reveal their true character not through declarations of principle, but through treatment of those entirely at their mercy. The America that German prisoners encountered was imperfect, but in its treatment of enemy captives, it largely honored the principles it claimed to be defending, a standard worth remembering in our own troubled times.